Hello, 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 and welcome to Most Writers Are Fans, the podcast that helps you on your writing journey. My name is Terry Bartley, and I'm your host. So usually in this show, I talk to other authors and other people in their publishing industry. We just sort of like talk about like craft and industry things and all that sort of stuff. But every now and again, I do these mini-sodes where I just get to talk to you guys about whatever I want. And the thing is, this podcast is called Most Writers Are Fans, so a lot of times I lean into the writer side of that. I'm going to lean a little bit further into the fan side this time. I actually started reading comic books in college. I was always like a big fan of comics. I watched like Justice League and all the like Bruce Timm stuff on Cartoon Network. And I was always really into it. It was really great. But whenever I got to college, I started reading Teen Titans. I was into the Teen Titans cartoon, and it just made sense to sort of like start following the new one. Geoff Johns was writing that like rebooted one that came out that time. The team was like Tim Drake and Connor Kent and Cassie Sandsmark and like some of the classic Titans were also there. But it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, and I really loved sort of like the dynamic of those characters and how we got to follow each of them individually as well as a unit. Like it was just really, really cool to see them kind of like build community and find themselves as teenagers. I've always really loved sort of like following these like younger characters. I feel like there's something special about sort of like the young adult nature of these characters where they're kind of like unsure what it is to be a hero. I feel like their hero identity isn't quite as like defined. There's something kind of cool about that because we get to kind of like explore it with them. But something that I noticed though, like whenever it would change writers or directions would change editorially, whatever, sometimes these characters would just kind of like disappear. But so as I was reading these books, I was reading it still actively whenever New 52 happened. This was like this like line-wide reboot for DC. They like rebooted every single title. So the new Teen Titans book I also read. It was written by Scott Lobdell. He's like a classic like X-Men writer. They brought him on to kind of like reimagine the Titans. And you know, I'm not the biggest fan of the reimagining, but I get it. Like they needed to change something and see what worked, what didn't. And they did a really weird thing with Cassie, Wonder Girl, Cassie Sandsmark. She had like a lot more there's a lot of like pain and suffering involved in her superpowers, which is kind of like the opposite of what she's always been. She's always been kind of like a joyful warrior. And this one, she had like a thorn covered like lasso and stuff. And her suit, she had like this super suit that was like hurting her constantly. It was like a whole thing. But it was a lot of wild changes. But it was like interesting nonetheless. But then she just sort of like disappeared, you know, like after a year or two, whenever Lobdell left those titles. So years passed. Cassie was just kind of like in a void. She was just like existing. She didn't really show up in books. She was just like a character who lived in the universe that no one ever saw. And then many years later, Brian Michael Bendis of Marvel fame, and he came into DC for a bit. He was writing a Young Justice series. Young Justice is a series that like Tim Drake and Bart Allen and Connor Kent and Cassie Sandsmark sort of like started as a team in. And he did a new series with them. So it was very cool to see all those characters again. Cassie was in the team again, but she was again fully rebooted. She was at this point a character wearing like a jacket with a Wonder Woman insignia on it and like a skirt. And you know, like the long blonde hair, it was like she was totally cute. I liked the aesthetic, but it was like super different. And then basically every storyline that Lobdell had written in the New 52 just like disappeared, like as though they never existed. And that's what I'm here to talk about, is this thing that happens to especially teen characters, especially like younger characters in comics, but a lot of characters, because they just sort of like stop being interested in them. Like their companies stop being interested in producing books about them. And then they just kind of like come back later with a different writer, or they don't come back at all sometimes. And I like to call this the lost generation problem. So Cassie is just like one in a long line of this, right? This is a thing that happens constantly. Both DC and Marvel have been guilty of it. DC does it a lot with like like I said, like their Teen Titans teams. It happens with a lot. I mean, even in that Brian Michael Bendis book, that wasn't all that long ago. He debuted Jenny Hex, who was sort of like this like descendant of Jonah Hex. It was a pretty cool character with like alien guns and stuff. But I've seen neither hide nor hair of her since that book ended. And it's just sort of like wild. These characters just fully disappear. And as somebody who gets really invested in these like side characters, especially like these more obscure characters, it is just super upsetting for them to just like vanish without anything. And then whenever they come back, because like maybe some writer was a fan of theirs, then they just kind of like rematerialize as a new version, and all of that history that we were invested in has just disappeared. It just happens over and over and over and over and over again. And it's really frustrating as a reader. And then on the Marvel side, like they do it too. Anybody who is a longtime X-Men fan can tell you they often will introduce a new class of X-Men because there's always sort of like a new young generation of X-Men that we're following. And basically every new class eventually sort of graduates, and oftentimes one or two of them will move on, but then like everyone else all but like vanishes. As an example of that, like Magik, Colossus's sister, she's like a big deal character. Like she's popped up in everything for quite a while now, but on her team was this guy named Chamber, who's pretty cool. His power was like, his heart was like this, like, just like constantly burning a furnace, and he didn't have like the lower half of his face and stuff. But he's like, he shows up every now and again, but otherwise he just kind of like exists and no one ever sees him. And the vast majority of X-Men are that. And the truth is, like, there are solutions to this problem. For like I mentioned with Magik, like she's a great example of somebody who debuted on a team and then just sort of like kept moving on onto other teams and being relevant. Like she's basically always been relevant in the X-Men ever since her debut. And I think that the clearest example of this is with Miles Morales and Kamala Khan, some Ms. Marvel Spider-Man, respectively. Spider-Man is a Bendis creation, so Bendis is back in the conversation. Ms. Marvel created by G. Willow Wilson. And both of those characters seemed like they were a priority for Marvel. Whenever Ms. Marvel debuted, she was like the top, like the Ms. Marvel comic was like the #1 selling digital title for a while. Miles was sort of like leading the Ultimate line as like the new Spider-Man. And they both kept getting integrated into things, right? Like Kamala was the lead of the Avengers video game by Square Enix. She was the lead of the Marvel Rising show that was like a bunch of young female heroes. And then Miles was, in the Spider-Man game. They had the two of them. He's the lead of the Spider-Verse movies that Sony is making. Like they both popped up in things. They both were in the Champions. They both were founding members of the Champions with Nova. And they just sort of like constantly been pushed and always been a part of something. And that's sort of like the solution to this problem. Whenever editorial cares about a character, they're going to make sure that there's always someone working on them and there's always some sort of like championing them. But that's sort of the problem. Is like whenever somebody leaves that has been championing this character that they don't often focus on, we just don't see them again. And I mean, like right now, Jaime Reyes had a really great story in Graduation Day with one of my former guests, Josh Trujillo. He wrote him. It was a really great story. But like the problem with that is like the minute the person championing them leaves, the character just kind of like no one cares anymore. And we just don't follow them for a while. And Jaime is such a perfect example of the Lost Generation problem because he debuted in 52, this like weekly series that led into an event, and he was like pitched this big deal, like he was a legacy hero because he like took the place of Ted Kord, who was like murdered in the book that led into this series. He is like alien technology, and Jaime has been in like almost every like Teen Titans, Young Justice, Justice League adaptation since he was created because his lore is so interesting and cool. But most of his lore is from like adaptations, because like so much of the comics, like he's not had enough comic history to establish that much lore. And that's wild because he's such a cool, interesting character. So like, it's just this thing that I think about all the time because it's just so wild to me that they introduce these interesting characters, we fall in love with them, and then they just like disappear because like that writer leaves or because there wasn't enough interest in that character, or oftentimes the brand doesn't feel like that character could carry a book by themselves, even though they've never had to, they've never tried, they've never seen if it would work. So like it is just something that I don't understand as a reader, and I feel like it's a real problem for comic fans because we fall in love with characters and we want to keep seeing them. And I think the true solution to this problem is like understanding the potential for story that these characters have. There's so many dangling character hooks. You could take them kind of anywhere because there's so many options of how you could make them like engaging and exciting again. So let's go back to Cassie Sandsmark, the character from the beginning of this conversation, a Wonder Girl. She is the daughter of Zeus, and so I know that in the beginning of New 52 they tried to make Diana the daughter of Zeus also, but DC has kind of like soft retconned that and just sort of like pretended like it never happened because I think that fans didn't love it. But Cassie, objectively, like no question, canonically is the daughter of Zeus. So with that in mind, if we're gonna presume that Diana is not Zeus's daughter, Cassie is the only Wonder character who's like the literal daughter of a god in the Greek pantheon. So there's like so much potential for that. I mean, Greek mythology, like the story of Hercules or any other demigod in Greek mythology, gives us like a playbook of what we could do with Cassie. I mean, the only place that I remember her really talking to Zeus and like implying some sort of like story there was at the very beginning of Bendis's Young Justice, but it was like a panel. And then, like, I think there was, like, a page of her talking to Zeus. She was, like, flying. He was flying. They were having, like, a daughter-father argument. And then we never revisited that. And that story never came up again. And it's just such wasted. And, like, I feel like this is so cool as an author, as a fantasy author who writes sort of, like, young adult adjacent work. Because, like, the Greek mythology stuff, especially with Cassie, where she's a demigod, there's real potential for like telling a story that metaphorically tells the story of like growing up and becoming an adult. Because like what we could do is sort of like this classic story of like most demigods where Cassie like goes on adventures, has to do trials for whatever reason. She has to do like 12 trials. Let's come up with some reason why she has to go on trials like Heracles did. And we just sort of like it's a 12 issue miniseries. Each issue is her doing a trial. Like that writes itself. And then at the end of the trials, like she is like worthy of being a god or whatever. Like there's, like she basically earns the right to become a full god. But then she has to choose, like, do I want to be a god or do I want to stay on Earth with my friends where I built a life? And like that is so true of like what most young people go through, like, do you want to go to this cool college that has a lot of exciting opportunities, but you've never met the people there, you don't know a lot about it? Or do you want to sort of like stay where you are and grow there? And like that's such a cool story that I think a lot of young people could benefit from. And the thing I love about Cassie especially is that she has a lot of like hooks for characters that we could have in her supporting cast. So obviously there's Tim and there's Connor, but also she was very close to Supergirl in the pre-New 52 era. I truly have no idea what Supergirl number we're on. Supergirl is like a whole other story with Lost Generation. I made you about her a video about her later, but she's like a whole other situation. But she was very close to Supergirl. And I feel like if we would bring in like a Stephanie Brown character, it'd be very cool to have like 3 blonde girls, 1 Bat, 1 Super, 1 Wonder, and let them like be a trinity that goes around the DCU together. That'd be kind of cool to see how that works. But like there's so much potential there. There's so many options of where we could take her as a character. And my point here is not that Cassie specifically should get a book. I love it if she does, but that's not what I'm trying to say here. My point here is that the Lost Generation problem is not just a problem, but it's also like a Lost Generation opportunity. It gives us this opportunity to tell stories with characters who haven't been central for a long time. And I think that brands, especially publishers, could greatly benefit from that because like they keep talking about how, they tell the same stories over and over again. People get tired of reading the same things. I think that pulling in these new characters, and not even new, but like characters who have been around for years, have followings already, have people who love them, center those characters again, and we could tell some really, really interesting, exciting stories. And I really hope that Marvel and DC listens to this and takes my lead. And the thing that I sort of hate about this problem as a reader is that I constantly worry whenever I see new young characters that the same thing's going to happen to them. Like Eve Ewing is writing the new X-Men book. It's like a big, like all of the X-Men are together doing training stuff. And like there were 3 or 4 young mutant characters in Exceptional X-Men that she was writing that I love. Like I love all of those characters, but I'm so terrified they're just gonna disappear in a year or two whenever Eve moves on to some other project. Same thing for Gail Simone. She's writing Uncanny right now, and there's a group called the Outliers who there's like I think there's like 4 or 5 here like young mutants, and I worry that whenever Gail moves on, which like and like no shade to any writer that moves on, like absolutely do like follow your heart and your inspiration as a writer. That's what I do as an author. But whenever they leave, if Marvel doesn't find some reason why any of those characters deserve to stick around, they could very easily fade away. And it's just a thing that I don't like seeing happen. And I also, it's just a thing, it's stress I don't need in my life, right? Like, I just don't need to be worried about, is this character going to disappear? I want to just enjoy the story. So, that's what I want for these characters. I don't want them to be reset. I don't want them to start over. I don't want, like, some new team. I just want to see the rest of their story. And I think that these characters deserve to have their story told, and I think that we as readers deserve to read them. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, do all the things. And until next time, don't be afraid to tell your stories.